July 20, 1969. Almost every human alive at the time remembers where they were. A black and white television screen. A shaky image. A man descending a ladder onto the surface of another world. Neil Armstrong's words became immortal. One small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. This moment is often described as the greatest technological achievement in human history. A triumph of science, engineering, and human ambition. And for most people, the story ends there. We went to the moon. We planted a flag. We came back. But history is rarely that simple. Because when we slow the story down, when we stop repeating it and start examining it, something strange happens. Questions begin to appear. Not wild questions. Not conspiracies. But quiet, uncomfortable gaps. Why was this achievement never repeated in the same way? Why does so much of the original data no longer exist? Why do the people who worked on Apollo speak about it with pride, but also with hesitation? This video is not about denying the moon landing. It is not about claiming it was staged. And it is not about turning science into suspicion. This is about something far more subtle. It is about whether the story we were given is complete. Because history does not always lie. Sometimes, it simply leaves things out. And the Apollo missions, more than any other event in modern history, sit at a strange intersection of science, politics, fear, and narrative control. Before we ask how we went to the moon. Before we examine the footage, the technology, or the missing records. We must first understand why this story was told the way it was. To do that, we have to go back. Not to the moon. But to Earth. To a divided planet. To a silent war. To a race where losing was not an option. To understand Apollo, we must first understand fear. In the late 1950s and early 1960s, the world was not calm. It was tense. Quietly terrified. Two superpowers stood on opposite sides of the planet, both armed with weapons capable of ending civilization. The United States. The Soviet Union. This was not a war fought with bullets. It was fought with symbols. When the Soviet Union launched Sputnik in 1957, it sent more than a satellite into space. It sent a message. We are ahead. When Yuri Gagarin became the first human in space, that message became louder. America was losing, not militarily, but psychologically. And in this climate, space stopped being science. It became narrative. The moon was not chosen because it was easy. It was chosen because it was visible. A rocket could fail in orbit and be hidden. But a man on the moon would be undeniable. John F. Kennedy understood this. When he announced the goal of landing a man on the moon, he was not speaking as a scientist. He was speaking as a strategist. The moon landing was never just about exploration. It was about proving capability. Control. Superiority. This does not mean Apollo was fake. But it does mean it was urgent. And urgency changes how stories are told. When a nation must succeed, failure becomes unacceptable. Doubt becomes dangerous. And complexity becomes inconvenient. Apollo was built under pressure unlike anything before it. Deadlines mattered more than perfection. Victory mattered more than documentation. This context is essential. Because when we later ask why certain data was lost, why procedures were improvised, why some decisions were never fully explained, the answer may not be deception. It may simply be haste. The Apollo missions were powered by machines that seem almost impossible by modern standards. The onboard computer that guided astronauts to the moon had less processing power than a modern calculator. Its memory was measured in kilobytes. Its interface was primitive. Its margin for error was razor-thin. And yet, it worked. This fact is often used in two opposite ways. Some say, if they did it with that technology, we can do anything. Others say, if that's all they had, how is it even possible? The truth lies somewhere in between. Apollo engineers did not rely on raw computing power. They relied on precision. On human calculation. On systems built specifically for one purpose, and nothing else. But here is the question that rarely gets asked. If this technology was sufficient, why was it never used again? Not upgraded. Not evolved. But abandoned. NASA itself has admitted that many Apollo-era systems can no longer be reproduced exactly. Not because we forgot science, but because the process knowledge was never fully preserved. Schematics were lost. Magnetic tapes were erased. Procedures existed only in the minds of engineers who later retired or passed away. This does not mean the moon landing was impossible. It means it was fragile. And fragile achievements are often poorly archived. Which leads us to one of the most unsettling facts of the entire Apollo story. Large portions of the original mission data. The raw telemetry. The uncompressed recordings. Are gone. The question, did we really go to the moon, did not begin on the internet. It started much earlier. In the late 1970s, only a few years after the Apollo program ended, the first serious doubts began to surface. Not because of a single shocking discovery, but because of accumulated inconsistencies. The first reason is psychological. The moon landing was an unprecedented achievement. Nothing like it had ever been done before, and nothing comparable has been done since. When an event is too large, too sudden, and never repeated, the human mind naturally becomes suspicious. The second reason is historical context. The moon landing happened during the Cold War, a time when propaganda was openly used by both sides. Governments lied frequently, exaggerated achievements, and hid failures. This created a long-lasting mistrust toward official narratives. The third reason is technical misunderstanding. Many people today compare Apollo technology to modern devices and conclude that it was impossible. They see computers with almost no memory, limited processing power, and manual calculations, and assume failure. But this comparison is misleading. Apollo systems were not general-purpose computers. They were task-specific machines, designed to do very little, but to do it extremely reliably. Still, doubt persisted. And then came the visual arguments. Strange shadows. Flag movement. Lighting that looks wrong. Camera angles that seem too perfect. These observations were repeated, simplified, and shared, often without technical explanation. Over time, these doubts solidified into full conspiracy theories. But doubt alone is not evidence. To answer this question properly, we must stop asking why people doubt. And start asking something more important. What actual, verifiable evidence exists? Before we can say whether the moon landing happened, we must define something very clearly. What would proof actually look like? In science and history, proof does not mean belief. It does not mean authority. And it does not mean repetition. Proof means independent verification. If humans really went to the moon, then evidence must exist that does not depend on NASA's word, American politics, Cold War propaganda. So what kind of evidence would satisfy that requirement? First, physical evidence. Objects brought back from the moon that can be tested independently. Second, measurable effects. Experiments that can still be observed today, decades later. Third, external observation. Data that could be detected or confirmed by other countries, other institutions, or other technologies. If the moon landing were fake, all of these layers would need to be fabricated, perfectly, and remain consistent for over 50 years. This sets a very high bar. So now, instead of asking emotional questions, we ask technical ones. Did astronauts bring back material that is not found on Earth? Did they leave something on the moon that we can still interact with today? Did other nations, including rivals, detect the missions independently? These questions have concrete answers. And this is where the discussion moves away from speculation and into measurable reality. Between 1969 and 1972, Apollo missions returned with 382 kilograms of lunar material. These moon rocks are one of the strongest pieces of evidence in this entire debate. Why? Because they are not controlled by NASA alone. Samples were distributed to laboratories around the world, including countries that were political rivals of the United States. Scientists in Europe, Asia, and even the Soviet Union analyzed them independently. The results were consistent. Moon rocks have isotopic ratios different from Earth rocks. No signs of water-based weathering. Exposure patterns caused by direct cosmic radiation. In simple terms, they were not formed on Earth. Could these rocks have come from meteorites? Yes, but meteorites have different shock signatures and chemical patterns. The Apollo samples do not match known lunar meteorites either. More importantly, the volume matters. Bringing back nearly 400 kilograms of such material would require a fabrication effort larger than the mission itself, with no mistakes, no leaks, and global scientific cooperation in silence. That scenario is far less plausible than the landing itself. Moon rocks do not prove every detail of the Apollo story. But they strongly support one core fact. Humans reached the lunar surface. The question now changes. If we went, why do so many people still doubt it? And why did we never return? If the moon landing were staged, one problem would remain unsolved. It would have to fool not just the public, but America's enemies. During the Apollo missions, the Soviet Union was actively tracking U.S. spacecraft. They had their own deep space antennas, radio telescopes, and tracking stations. They were listening. Apollo spacecraft continuously transmitted radio signals back to Earth. These signals were not private. They traveled through open space and could be intercepted by anyone with the right equipment. And they were. Radio observatories in multiple countries independently tracked Apollo missions as they traveled to the moon, entered lunar orbit, landed, and returned. The signals did not originate from Earth. They came from the direction of the moon, following the expected trajectory. If the landing had been faked, the Soviet Union would have known. And more importantly, they would have said so. Instead, they congratulated the United States. In the context of the Cold War, this silence matters. The USSR had nothing to gain from protecting an American lie. Exposing a fake moon landing would have been one of the greatest propaganda victories imaginable. Yet it never happened. This does not prove that every image was perfect or every procedure flawless. But it strongly suggests that the missions themselves were real. Because space does not care about narratives. Radio signals cannot be persuaded. And rival nations do not protect each other's myths. One of the most overlooked pieces of evidence is also one of the simplest. During the Apollo missions, astronauts placed retroreflectors on the lunar surface. These are small arrays of mirrors designed to reflect light directly back to its source. Today, scientists on Earth still use them. Powerful lasers are fired at the moon. A tiny fraction of that light hits the reflector and returns. By measuring the time it takes for the light to come back, scientists can calculate the distance to the moon with millimeter-level precision. This experiment does not rely on belief. It does not rely on NASA's authority. It relies on physics. The reflectors are still there. They still work. And they are exactly where Apollo missions reported placing them. Could robotic missions have placed them? In theory, yes. But at the time, no robotic lander had the precision, stability, and deployment capability required for such instruments. More importantly, multiple reflectors exist at different Apollo landing sites. Their positions match mission records. This is not a single artifact. It is a system. Every laser pulse that returns from the moon confirms one basic fact. Something human-made was placed on the lunar surface, exactly when and where Apollo claimed. This does not solve every mystery. But it eliminates one major doubt. If the evidence is strong, why does doubt persist? The answer is not scientific. It is human. First, the moon landings ended abruptly. After 1972, humans never returned. No continuation, no expansion, no visible progress. For many people, this feels wrong. Second, NASA itself admitted mistakes. Original telemetry tapes were erased. Some engineering documentation was lost. This created the impression of carelessness, or worse. Third, visual evidence aged badly. Low-resolution footage that once felt miraculous now looks unconvincing in a high-definition world. What was once impressive now feels suspicious. And finally, trust eroded. From Vietnam to Watergate, the same era that produced the moon landing also produced major government deception. People learned that official statements are not always honest. So the doubt did not come from one lie. It came from many unrelated truths. The moon landing sits at the intersection of extraordinary achievement and historical mistrust. And that is why the question never disappears. Not because the landing is false, but because the story was never told with enough transparency to survive modern scrutiny. The most persistent question is also the simplest one. If we really went to the moon, why did we stop? After Apollo 17 in 1972, human missions to the moon ended abruptly. No permanent base. No follow-up program. No return. This silence created suspicion. The first reason is cost. Apollo was not just expensive, it was historically extreme. At its peak, it consumed over 4% of the entire U.S. federal budget. Adjusted for inflation, Apollo cost hundreds of billions of dollars. The moon landing was never designed to be sustainable. It was a sprint, not a system. Once the political objective was achieved, beating the Soviet Union, funding collapsed. Public interest declined. Congress redirected money elsewhere. The second reason is risk. Apollo missions were extraordinarily dangerous. Astronauts accepted a level of risk that would be unacceptable today. Several near disasters occurred, some only narrowly avoided catastrophe. Modern space agencies operate under far stricter safety expectations. One fatal mission today could end a program entirely. The third reason is practicality. The moon offers limited immediate economic return. No breathable atmosphere. No easy resources. No strategic advantage once symbolic victory was achieved. So the decision was not, we can't go back. It was, there is no reason strong enough to justify the cost and risk. This does not feel satisfying. But history often isn't. Many moon landing doubts focus on visuals. The flag appears to move. Shadows look strange. Stars are missing from the sky. Each of these has a technical explanation. The flag did not wave in wind. It moved because it was mounted on a horizontal support rod. When astronauts handled it, motion continued in a vacuum where nothing slows it down. The shadows appear inconsistent because the moon's surface is uneven and highly reflective. Light scatters off the ground, creating secondary illumination. This confuses the human eye, especially in low-resolution images. And the stars? They were not visible because the cameras were set for bright lunar daylight. Stars are faint. The exposure settings simply did not capture them. These explanations are not after-the-fact excuses. They are basic physics. The problem is not that the explanations don't exist. The problem is that they are rarely explained clearly. When simple questions receive complicated answers, people assume deception. But complexity is not a cover-up. It is reality. When we step back and look at the full picture, something becomes clear. There is no single piece of evidence that proves the moon landing alone. But there is also no single flaw that disproves it. Instead, there is convergence. Moon rocks analyzed worldwide. Radio signals tracked independently. Laser reflectors still functioning. Rival nations remaining silent. These facts point in one direction. Humans reached the moon. But the doubts also make sense. The story was rushed. The documentation was imperfect. The narrative was simplified for political reasons. And simplified stories do not age well. So the real lesson is not about the moon. It is about how history is told. When extraordinary events are presented without transparency, they invite suspicion, even when they are true. The moon landing was real. But the way it was explained left room for doubt. And that doubt, once born, never completely disappears. So, did we really go to the moon? Based on the evidence, yes. Humans reached the lunar surface. But that answer was never the real reason this question survived for decades. The doubt was never only about rockets, flags, or footage. It was about trust. The moon landing happened in an era where governments spoke in slogans. Where failures were hidden. And where success had to look perfect. History was simplified. Complexity was removed. And what remained was a story too clean to age well. When parts of the data disappeared. When documentation was incomplete. When the mission stopped without a clear explanation. Space was filled by suspicion. Not because the achievement was false. but because the explanation was insufficient. The moon landing reminds us of something important. Even true events can be doubted. If they are not told honestly, completely, and transparently. History does not demand belief. It demands evidence. And sometimes, it also demands patience. Because understanding often comes much later than the event itself. The real question was never, did we go to the moon? The real question is, how many true stories do we misunderstand? Simply because they were never fully explained.